Hi and welcome to this video. Today I'm in one of my favourite walking locations in Wales. I'll be covering a number of topics today to help improve your photography. So let's get started and we'll take a walk up the valley. Let's first talk about equipment. Now this may seem an obvious one, but it's absolutely critical that you master your equipment. I personally use manual all of the time with the histogram. It's absolutely vital that you learn this skill.
I'll demonstrate this in manual mode. By making the shutter speed faster, you'll notice that the histogram moves to the left and the image gets darker. As I lengthen the shutter speed, you'll notice that the histogram moves to the right and the image brightens. So now let's create the same effect by adjusting the aperture. Here we'll increase the f-stop. You'll notice that again the histogram moves to the left, and now as we decrease the f, you'll notice it brightens the image and the histogram moves to the right. So let's now look at changing the ISO. Here we'll look at increasing the ISO. By increasing the ISO, we're increasing the speed at which the sensor picks up details. So by increasing it to 400, you'll notice the histogram moved to the right and we overexpose the image. So we can pull back on the shutter speed. If we further increase it to 1600, you'll notice that again it's moved to the right. I hope this brief explanation gives you enough information to go out into the field and practice this relationship between the aperture, the ISO and the shutter speed.
Understand how aperture priority, speed priority and manual all interact in different scenarios.
Let's talk about the lenses required as well. I use a 10-18 and an 18-135 on an APS-C sensor camera. These zoom ranges are perfect for my landscape photography, giving me the wide angle lens and also a decent amount of zoom. I recommend getting a zoom lens that suits your needs, specifically for landscape photography, something in the wider angle initially. The 18-135 was a perfect starter lens for me. I then progressed onto the much wider angle 10-18, and I will soon be progressing to a 100-400mm zoom. This is ideal then for zooming in super close on those landscape and giving the opportunity to start progressing into wildlife photography too. I recommend considering which kind of photography you require, whether you start off on the wide angle for landscape, whether you then progress onto telephoto, or whether you start with a more telephoto oriented lens for wildlife, etc., and then progressing maybe more to the wide angle for landscape.
So get yourself a really sturdy tripod. That's my first recommendation. And secondly, on the equipment front, check out certain filters. For landscape, polarizing filter is a necessity. And also check out neutral density filters if you want to slow down such things as waterfall scenes or do long exposures. Also, if your budget stretches to it, I would recommend the acquisition of a remote control for landscape photography and filming. The second topic I want to cover is on location shooting. First things first is, do not rush into taking lots of photographs. It's vital to look around the scene and not think, how am I going to take this picture, but why am I going to take it? So once you've scoped out the scene, it's vital to look at signs, the leading lines of the water, the wind across it. Really look at not just the foreground, but the background. Are there any distractions within that? So learn to observe the scene. Look at your photographs after you've taken them when you've got them home, and look at what you could improve on. Brings me to another vital point, which is actually to come back to the same location time and time again. Especially if it's local, that's really easy. That'll improve your photography. Take the same composition in different weather conditions. Take the same composition from different angles. Learn what works and what doesn't. Use the composition rules, and I'll talk a little bit more about composition in just one second. So here we've got an amazing scene. We've got the lake, we've got the ripples, the wind's just blowing across it. I hope it's not disrupting the sound too much. We've got the mountain in the background and the cliffs of the mountain and the peaks. The clouds are rolling through, so we've got blue skies intermittent with white skies. When scoping out the scene, it's critical that we think about our composition and why we're taking that photograph. Having established why we're taking this photograph, let's look at any leading lines. Here we have stream, for example. We have the horizontal line opposite on the lake, the top, the peak, the ridge line. So I've changed scene slightly now on account as I was hit by a slight snowstorm there. So I've changed scene now, a little bit less windy hopefully. So yeah, as we've discussed, composition is absolutely critical. We've got the lid of the mountains in the background, we've got the edge of the lake, we've got the foreground rocks. All of these we can use for composing our images and understanding why we're taking that image. Why are we including a rock in the foreground? To give it a little bit of a layered context feel. So these things are absolutely vital. And again, I'll be creating videos on each of these aspects in a lot more detail.
I'll go through later the workflow for post-processing that I use for these kind of images. But first I want to go through some of the composition overlays that are useful to have in mind both when post-processing and also when on location to have in your mind when setting the image scene. So this first overlay is the classic rule of thirds. We are close to the rule of thirds. You can see that the horizon and the mountain ridge is close to that, with the individual on the peak just close to that golden third just there. And also the fence post trailing in as a leading line from the bottom third. The other one to consider is the diagonal leading lines. We can see here that the fence leads us in to the image and the peak is right on the cut through of the diagonal, making this as an ideal position in terms of dissection of the image itself. And the third one that I find particularly useful is the golden spiral. You can see here again that the peak is right in the sweet spot of the spiral itself. Although the rest of the image doesn't necessarily support this too strongly, the actual location of the peak is particularly strong in this context. So what we can see from the three overlays is there are elements of each that are supported in this image to make it a much more pleasing final image.
The other element I want to talk about, the other aspect, is practice. It's absolutely vital. Coming to the same location over and over again allows you to practice taking the same composition in different conditions, from different angles, taking the same composition in different weather conditions to understand the equipment and the camera, better understand the composition that we've talked about. I've also been practicing with leading lines, silhouettes, etc. So it's absolutely key coming to the same place repetitively and practicing using the techniques that you're learning all the time will improve your photography. The more that you practice, the better you'll be able to visualize the final result from post-processing. And one of the things when on location is also remember the changing scene. Here today we've got the sun keeps breaking through the clouds, we've got snowstorms passing through. Keep an eye out for changing and variable conditions, how the sun captures the sides of the mountains, how it streams down the valley, how the clouds are going across the sky, etc. All of these will help you improve your composition.
Now that we've established the equipment and the on-location aspects, let's go on to post-processing. Here I'll be using Lightroom. This is one of the images that we captured on the day. The key element to consider for post-processing is to capture all images in RAW format. JPEG image compression loses too much detail from your images, oversaturates in the first instance, and you'll find that your post-process editing process will be so much more tricky. And you'll find that your post-process editing will actually make the image quality significantly worse in a number of occasions. For the purposes of this video, what I've done here is go back to my original image that was captured on the day. Here I was able to visualize the final image through post-processing, which resulted in this image here. I have made and will be making further videos on how to do detailed editing within Lightroom. What I want to do here is just give you an idea of the kind of high-level post-processing and the steps that are required for you to take. So the way that Adobe Lightroom is often formed is here is your histogram. Remember the histogram from the camera. That is something to relate to as well. You can drag and drop, you can just click, you can move the image. I'm actually going to just go through this edit. One of the first things that I often do is go into crop. So here you can see how I cropped this image. I've used the 4:5 format. You could use any of these potential formats as required for either print or screen display. Obviously for screen display, maybe 16:9 is your preferred format. You can straighten the image. You can see here that the image was slightly offset, so I've used the angle to straighten that image. I often then will do any particular touch-up that's required, but I will also do masks. I have two masks in this. I have the sky selected, which is a very good one to utilize when doing landscapes. And here I have a gradient mask in the foreground, just to make sure that I can balance and layer the image. Remember the layers that we talked about in the actual image capture, so that we have the depth within the photograph. So we have the foreground, we have the mid-range, and then we have the distance of the mountains as well. So let's close down those masks and let's go look at the basic. One of the fundamental things is to change, I changed the profile to Adobe Landscape. That to me is the preferred one. There are a massive number of profiles within Adobe Lightroom, but this is the one that I prefer and use as standard. I very seldom change the white balance. That is something that the camera, if you're capturing in RAW and using manual mode, you'll find that you very seldom have to change that. I then will adjust the exposure and the contrast first. That's normally my mode of operation. I use a top-down approach in this. I would then, so I've done the masks, I've edited the masks, I will now start to edit the tone of the picture, the overall tone. And you can see here that we can change this quite dramatically. You can see that in essence, what we were doing in the histogram is the same. I will then start to look at the presence. This is the vibrancy, whether there's any haze. So you can see we've got quite a bit. You can see how it's actually adding haze, for example. It's making the image a lot brighter, getting rid of any vagueness in the image. The vibrancy I've actually reduced on this one because it was a little bit too vibrant. So I will always do that top-down approach. And then finally, I will look at the HSL. I'm not going to go into tone curves and things like that right now. Those are for future videos. Those are a little bit more advanced. But I would recommend looking initially at the saturation and the luminance and the hue. Start with the saturation, move on to luminance. Sometimes you may find that the saturation is increased and the luminance is decreased, because the saturation, you then want to pull, when it's become oversaturated, you want to pull back the brightness of that particular color. You can also look at things like lens corrections. Once you understand which lens it's been taken with, you can understand then, you can see that it's taken out a little bit of the pincushion effect around the top of the ridge. So that's something that you can enable as well. And sometimes depends on my initial image, but one of the effects that you can add is a little bit of vignetting. So you can actually, that's going the wrong way for me. So you can just give it a little bit of a vignette just to try. This one isn't that great for that, but it just draws the eye into the center of the image. So it may be worth just having a very small bit of vignetting on this final image. So that's the kind of process that I go through and would recommend that you adopt. So I would recommend that you do a top-down approach. So begin with the crop that you are envisaging for your final image. Look at the masks that you require and any healing that you may want to repair, any dust that you've got on the image, etc. I would then look at the kind of profile that you want for the final image and start to think about the overall tone, the presence of the image, and then finally move on to some of the saturation, the hue, the luminance of each of the individual color spectrums, and then work down through to the potential vignetting that you may want for the final image. I will be making more videos on this, on each of these and how I did the editing and each of these aspects in a lot more detail. Some of those are already in place. Feel free to check those out.
Thank you very much for your time. I hope that you found some of the tips and aspects in this video useful. As ever, please feel free to comment below and please like and subscribe this video to help support the channel and get notifications of future videos. Thank you very much.